It was Emancipation Day late this week, August the 1st, this year, marking the 190th anniversary of the passing in Britain of the Slavery Abolition Act, outlawing the owning, buying and selling of humans as property throughout the then British Empire across the world. It was a huge source of inspiration and hope in the fight against slavery in many other places of the world, like Africa itself, the Middle East and Asia, and of course, the United States. Britain was the first. But we're not teaching kids in schools about this amazing aspect of our history because it doesn't fit the narrative of Western world bad, Christian ideals bad, white men bad, etc., etc. In fact, it counters those common misconceptions. The think tank, the Australian Institute for Progress, holds an event to mark the anniversary of the Slavery Abolition Act every year. The AIP's Executive Director, Graham Young, sat down with me at this year's Emancipation Day event to discuss its significance.
A day that's recognised around the world. It started in Trinidad and Tobago, which was obviously a slave economy at some stage, but just 2 years ago, Canada, which had very minor examples of slavery in the eastern provinces, decided to make Emancipation Day a national day on the 1st of August 1834. The Abolition of Slavery Act came into force, and for the next 50 or more years, the British spent anywhere up to 2% of their GDP trying to eradicate slavery around the world.
So it's really interesting that because it's not just about Britain. It was the entire British Empire that this applied to, but they went even beyond that in terms of how they tried to reduce the problem of slavery.
Yeah, I think one of the best examples of that is that Brazil was an ally of theirs because they were always fighting with the Spanish. Brazil's Portuguese, and had a very big slave economy because they were into sugar, and they blockaded Brazil and said, you have to abolish slavery. So they picked on allies as well as enemies. It would have been against their security and economic interests to pick on an ally like that. So yeah, it's an outstanding example of international human rights with some real grunt behind it. You know, a lot of people today talk a good book when it comes to human rights, but they don't actually do anything about it. Most countries don't do anything about it outside their own borders, and even then, most of them aren't all that good within their own borders. But here you've got a country that went out. It was dominant because it had that huge empire and it had a huge naval force to basically keep peace on the waters and ensure that trade could carry forth. And they used that not just for trade purposes, but humanitarian purposes. It was essentially a moral and ethical position. The first people who agitated for it were evangelical Anglican ministers. John Wesley, whose followers subsequently formed the Methodist Church, was one of the first.
This year, the event put the spotlight on a guy named John Newton. He lived from 1725 to 1807 and is best known as the man who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. But John Newton was a leading English slavery abolitionist. He served as a sailor in the Royal Navy, participated in the slave trade himself, and he was himself enslaved for a time to an African princess, no less, in West Africa.
He apparently was a bit of a libertine and a ruffian and didn't necessarily get on with the people on ship. So it was a very rough trade, and this particular ship, they decided they'd had enough of him and they gave him over to the Africans. But slavery, so there was white slavery. White slaves were highly prized in the Ottoman Empire, and the corsairs used to go along the coast, the east coast of Africa, and west coast of Africa and west coast of Europe, even up to Cornwall. There's recordings of them having made slave trading raids into Cornwall in the 16th and 17th century. So it wasn't just the Europeans, but as with everything around that period of time, the Europeans got very sort of industrial scale with it. So their trade was done to another level. But you also have to understand that they didn't go and capture the slaves. That was Africans enslaving other Africans. You know, the Vikings were slavers, and a whole lot of people traded in slaves, and it was a smash and grab. It wasn't having a war with people. You end up with Captives, what do you do with a captive? Well, back in the day, you either slaughtered them or you enslaved them. There was a trade. There were people stealing people from other people, and that was part of what was going on in Africa as well. So it's an interesting mixed bag, and it'd be interesting to know some of the people leading the charge for reparations in the US, whether some of their relatives may well have actually in Africa been part of the slave trade as perpetrators, not just victims. You know, it's something that I think everyone needs to look at a lot more closely before we start buying into present day guilt and presentism.
Yeah, Graham Young speaking to me about the British moves to abolish slavery almost 200 years ago at the AIP's Emancipation Day event in Brisbane this week. Hope you enjoyed that clip. The Other Side is your weekly analysis of the media's best news and commentary without the woke, and we need your support. Please make sure you subscribe to our channel on YouTube and follow us on X at The Other Side on X. It's all totally free to do that, but we could always do with your financial support too. So if you'd like to make a donation, click the Super Thanks button on YouTube with a little $ and thanks on it right under the video frame below. Even a $2 donation will really help us. And if you're watching on YouTube, do check out the full episode that this clip came from right here.